President Obama and his successors to gain confirmation of presidential nominees. As a Republican senator during a Democratic administration, I spent dozens of hours on this project to make it easier for that Democrat president, with a Senate majority that was Democratic, to form a government. We changed the rules the right way. In other words, we followed the rules. And the Senate passed standing orders with large bipartisan margins to do a number of things. We ended secret holds. We removed 163 major positions from the necessity of advice and consent. We removed 3,163 minor positions from advise and consent. We created 272 positions that are presidential nominations and made them privileged so they could come to the floor and then go on to be voted on if no one objected or required them to go to committee. We made it easier to bring legislation to the floor. We made it easier to go to conference. We simplified the forms you have to fill out if you're a nominee. We did all that in a bipartisan way. And one more thing, by a vote with 78 votes, we decided we would reduce the post-cloture debate time for sub-cabinet members to 8 hours and for district judges 2 hours. As a practical matter, that means that if the majority leader brings up a sub-cabinet member on Monday, we have to wait an intervening day, that's Tuesday, and then we vote on cutting off debate on Wednesday, and then how many hours more do we need to debate it? Then it was 30. Today it's 30. We said then let's make it 8 for sub-cabinet members and 2 for district judges. That expired at the end of President Obama's time because we made it for just one Congress, but that's what we did. And I might add, Republicans did not insist that these new rules should be delayed until after the next presidential election, when there might be a Republican president. You might say we rose above politics. And I might add, some people today say, well, they don't want to vote for anything that might seem to support President Trump because he's not popular in the Democratic primary. I can tell you President Obama was not all that popular in 2013 in the Republican primary in Tennessee or in many of the other primaries. But we thought it was more important to defend this institution and preserve its traditional role, constitutional role of advise and consent. So on February 25th of this year, I came to the floor and invited my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to rise above politics, in effect. The same thing they often say to me. I invited them to work with me and with Senator Langford, Senator Blunt, to speed up the confirmation of presidential nominees. Rise above partisanship, rise above politics for the benefit of the institution. And it was a pretty easy ask, I might say, Mr. President, because I'm basically inviting them to do what 78 of us agreed to do in 2013, to reduce the amount of post-cloture debate time for sub-cabinet members and district judges. I don't think rising above politics ought to be a one-way street. At a time when many complain that the executive has too much power, the Senate is deliberately weakening itself when we undermine our advise and consent role. What's the result of that? Well, it diminishes our constitutional role to advise and consent, because what happens in the executive branch is it just is loaded up with acting appointees who've never had to go through our confirmation process. President Trump probably is pretty happy with that. He can just put an acting person in a particular position. That person doesn't have to go through the process, doesn't have to answer a lot of questions. He or she is just there and immediately there. Doesn't have to, as the TVA board member from my state, John Ryder, doesn't have to wait a year. Or as 2 district judges from my state, excellent individuals, waited 10 months to be confirmed. Whereas the U.S. attorney from the Middle District of Tennessee, who had already been the U.S. attorney before, he had to wait more than a year. There was none of that. You just put in an acting person and run the government without regard to the Senate. So I would as the Democratic leader said to me 2 weeks ago and 6 weeks ago, I would ask him and others to rise above politics for the benefit of this institution and change the rules the right way to speed up the confirmation process. Senate Rules Committee gave us the right way. They adopted a resolution in the regular order, basically the same resolution with a few differences that we passed with 78 votes in 2013. In my February 25th speech, I said to my friends on the other side, if you don't like it in exactly the form it is, please suggest something reasonable back. That's the way we do things. Let's amend it. Let's do it the way we did it exactly before in 2013. I've been encouraged by some discussion, by some members of the other side of the aisle, but nothing certain. The proposal offered by Senator Blunt and Senator Lankford would not reduce the number of hours we debate Supreme Court justices, wouldn't reduce the number of hours we debate cabinet members or certain board nominations, but would divide the 30 hours of post-cloture debate equally between Republicans and Democrats. Basically, it would put the Senate back in the place where the Senate has always been. Throughout the history of the Senate, nominations have been decided by 51 votes, not 60 or 67, by 51. And they've been decided reasonably promptly. Sometimes they were defeated, but they were decided. So the Blunt-Lankford resolution would do just that. Nominations would be decided by 51 votes, and they could be decided reasonably promptly. So we would not be diminishing the advice and consent role of the Senate. Now, everyone in this body knows what the problem is. 128 times, the majority leader has had to file a motion to cut off debate, we call that cloture, in order to advance a nomination of, say, a Tennessee Valley Authority part-time board member. So he'll file the motion on Monday. We'll wait. We don't do anything on Tuesday. Nothing would change with that. We vote on cloture on Wednesday. That's 51 votes. And then we have 30 hours of debate, so it's Thursday. So we can take a whole week. We can take a whole week dealing with a part-time TVA board member. 128 times that's been done. That was almost never done for previous presidents. So we are faced, Madam President, with a truly miserable choice. We know this has to change. Our friends on the other side know it has to change. They know that if they have a Democratic president in 18 months or 20 months, that there'll be at least one Republican senator who will do to them what they're doing to President Trump, and the Democratic senator won't be able to form a government. And so we'll further diminish the Senate and its role. So we have a truly miserable choice. Either we continue to diminish the constitutional advice and consent role of the Senate. We can do that. Or we use what we call the Harry Reid precedent to change the rules of the Senate by majority vote. The problem with the Harry Reid precedent is it doesn't really change the rules. It just says the rules don't mean what they say. It's as if the referee said, well, the rule book says the first down is 10 yards, but I'm going to rule that it's 9. But it is a Senate precedent, and majority may do that. But we should avoid that if we possibly can. I don't like the Harry Reid precedent. I believe it presents a truly miserable option. But even more miserable is continuing this debasement of the advice and consent role of the Senate, one that I worked on in 2011, 12, and 13 with the distinguished Democratic leader and the Republican leader and so many senators to do more about. So as the Democratic leader, who I say has come to the floor now, my friend, said to me and to other Republicans 2 weeks ago, I understand the politics are difficult, much harder for you than for me, but our nation, our Constitution, the beauty of this government demands that we rise to the occasion. Well, on that occasion, the declaration of the national emergency, 12 of us did. And a few weeks earlier, on reopening the government, 6 of us did. In 2011, 12, and 13, 78 of us voted to reduce the post-cloture time for sub-cabinet nominees. So I know it can be a difficult vote in the Democratic caucus, but I earnestly hope that between now and the time we vote this week, that we won't be presented with this truly miserable choice of continuing to debase the advise and consent tradition of the Senate, or using the Harry Reid precedent to change the Senate rules by majority vote. If some of us can rise above partisanship on Article 1 to vote against the declaration of emergency, to vote to reopen the government, to remove the delay in presidential nominees when there's a Democratic president and a Democratic leader of the Senate, it is my hope that some of my Democratic friends will agree to do that this week and help us avoid what I've described as a truly miserable choice. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.